You know, all those anti-money laundering efforts we hear about, like the regulations and all that stuff aimed at stopping criminals from cleaning their dirty cash. Well, in today's deep dive, we're really going to look at the question, are AML efforts actually working? Like, I mean, are we truly disrupting financial crime, or are we just kind of going through the motions?
That is like the million-dollar question, and to be honest, the answer is kind of unsettling. Elisa de Anda Madrazo, she's the president of the Financial Action Task Force, and she recently revealed that less than 2% of criminal proceeds are actually confiscated globally.
Less than 2%.
Oh, wow.
That's shockingly low. So what's FATF's perspective on why we're seeing such a low rate of asset recovery?
Well, you know, FATF, they're like the global authority when it comes to setting AML standards, right? And lately, they've been putting a huge emphasis on asset recovery. They really see it as like the key to actually making AML effective.
Okay, that makes sense.
And some of their recent reports suggest that something like 80% of countries are really struggling to effectively confiscate criminal assets.
80%, that's a huge number. So what's preventing all these countries from effectively seizing those assets? What are the roadblocks?
It's really a complex web of challenges. You know, some countries just don't have the resources or the trained personnel or the technology to effectively track and seize these assets.
Right.
Others are sort of stuck with these outdated laws that haven't really kept pace with how financial crime has evolved.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And then, of course, you always have to factor in the issue of corruption, which can just completely undermine any legal framework that's in place.
So we're talking about practical limitations like resources and laws,
Mm.
but also these bigger kind of systemic issues like corruption. So if we layer on top of this that most countries are struggling to actually seize the money,
Mm.
it makes you wonder about all these stricter AML laws that keep popping up all the time.
Right.
I mean, are they really effective, or are they just kind of for show?
Yeah, it's a really valid point. If criminals are able to hold on to the profits from their illegal activities, are we really deterring them? You know, are we
Yeah.
so focused on like checking all the compliance boxes that we've missed the forest for the trees?
It really makes you think, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, we're spending all this time and money on AML compliance, but are we actually achieving the intended goal?
Well, you know, remember that old principle, follow the money?
Yeah.
Seizing assets really strikes at the heart of these criminal organizations. It disrupts how they operate, it cuts off funding for future crimes, and it sends a powerful message that crime ultimately doesn't pay.
So asset recovery is crucial, but what does that look like in the real world? Like, what are some...
Well, without naming specific countries, we can definitely look at what sets the successful jurisdictions apart. Typically, they have a really robust legal framework that clearly defines the whole process of how you seize criminal assets, and it's backed up by, adequate resources. They invest in dedicated units within law enforcement and the judicial system that are specifically focused on financial crime.
So it's not enough to just have laws on the books, right? You need the infrastructure and the expertise to actually enforce them.
Yeah.
What else have you noticed that sets these successful countries apart?
Another really crucial factor is that they have a strong emphasis on international collaboration. They understand that financial crime doesn't stop at borders, so they're actively working with other countries to track down assets and to exchange intelligence.
That makes a lot of sense, yeah, especially with how easy it is to move money around the world these days. So are there any other, like, key elements you've noticed to these successful countries? What else are they doing?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Technology plays a huge role. They're really investing in these advanced tools, like AI and data analytics and blockchain analysis, trying to keep up with the, sophisticated techniques criminals use to launder money.
So they're using cutting-edge tech, basically, to connect the dots and stay ahead of the curve. Sounds like a really comprehensive approach.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
And don't forget about public-private partnerships. These successful countries really encourage open communication and information sharing between like financial institutions and law enforcement. By pooling their knowledge and resources together, they can be so much more effective in identifying and seizing these criminal assets.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So this all kind of points to a significant shift, I think, moving beyond just like trying to prevent money laundering and moving more towards actually pursuing the money itself. But this begs the question, does that create a resource trade-off? Like if we're pouring more resources into asset recovery, are we kind of taking away from other AML priorities?
That is a very important question, and it's something that's being debated a lot right now in the AML community. Resources are limited, so any shift in focus will involve making some tough choices. But the argument, the argument for prioritizing asset recovery is that it can be way more impactful in the long run.
This is not necessarily about doing less, but about doing things differently, like being more strategic with how we allocate those resources.
Exactly. Yeah. If we can prove that seizing assets is like a more effective deterrent, then it could justify, shifting resources away from, say, like overly burdensome compliance procedures that might not be yielding a lot of results.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good point. So this has been incredibly eye-opening, but I want to kind of bring it back down to earth a bit for our listeners. Like,
Hmm.
for someone working in this field, say a compliance officer or a financial investigator, how can they actually incorporate this like asset recovery mindset into their everyday work?
I mean, it all starts with staying informed, right? Um, Keep up with the latest FATF recommendations, really get to know the ins and outs of the asset recovery laws in your own jurisdiction, and stay current on the tools and technologies that are available.
So being proactive is key, basically not just waiting for something suspicious to pop up.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Proactivity is super important. Make sure you know your team is properly trained in asset recovery techniques, build those strong relationships with law enforcement, and think about investing in the technologies that can help you actually identify and track potentially illicit funds.
And I imagine there's a role for like advocacy here as well, right? Like businesses can really push for stronger asset recovery mechanisms within their own countries.
Absolutely. Change doesn't just come from the top down. Businesses have a powerful voice, and they can definitely use it to advocate for, more effective laws, better funding for law enforcement, and stronger international cooperation.
It feels like we're talking about kind of a fundamental shift in how we approach AML. It's not just about checking boxes for compliance, but actually fighting back against financial crime by hitting criminals where it hurts most to their bottom line.
It's a shift that's long overdue. For AML efforts to really be effective, we need to move beyond just preventing money laundering and really focus on like dismantling the financial underpinnings of these criminal organizations.
So after this deep dive into how effective AML actually is and the crucial role of asset recovery, what's the key takeaway for our listeners today?
I think the main point we need to drive home is that focusing on asset recovery is just absolutely essential if we want AML to make a real difference. Laws and regulations are great, they're a good starting point, but they're not enough on their own. We have to actually work to strip these criminals of their ill-gotten gains, and that means investing in the tools, the resources, the expertise to really effectively seize those assets.
It's about making sure that crime doesn't pay. Not just because you might face legal consequences, but because will be coming for your money.
Exactly. Just imagine like a world where criminals not only face prosecution, but they also lose everything they gained illegally. What kind of deterrent effect would that have, right?
Yeah, I think it would be a game changer for sure. It would definitely make criminal activity a much less appealing prospect.
Exactly. And that's the shift we need. We need to take the power away from the criminals and give it back to the people fighting for a fairer and more just financial system.
Well, this has been such an insightful discussion. Is there any final thought you'd like to leave our listeners with today?
I would just encourage everyone to think about how they can contribute to more effective asset recovery efforts, whether it's by, advocating for stronger laws or implementing really robust internal controls within your organization, or just, even just staying informed about the latest developments in the field. Every little bit helps.
This conversation is really just the beginning. We need to keep the dialogue going, share ideas, work together to make asset recovery a central part of AML efforts all over the world.
I completely agree. And we would love to hear from our listeners. What are your thoughts on this topic? What challenges are you facing in your work? Let's keep this conversation going and try to find solutions together.
Well, thanks for joining us today on this deep dive into the world of AML and asset recovery. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning the status quo, and keep up the good fight.